The station was never quiet at night. It hummed. The walls, the floors, the long corridors that stretched between one section and another, they all carried a low, steady vibration that never really stopped. Jay had gotten used to it after 3 years of living aboard Conclave Orbital Station 7. He stopped noticing the hum the same way a man stops noticing his own heartbeat. It was just there. He was alone in the communication room when the message came through. It was not meant for him. It was not meant for any human. The transmission was encrypted in a conclave-tier cipher that no human diplomat was supposed to be able to read. But Jay had spent 2 years quietly learning the cipher on his own time, the same way he quietly learned everything, without telling anyone, without making noise about it, just sitting with it until it made sense. The message was short. The message was very clear. He read it once. Then he read it again. Then he sat completely still for a long time. The Conclave's sovereign tier, the highest governing body in the galaxy, made up of the oldest and most powerful species, had passed something called Decree 9 of the Galactic Codex. Jay had read the Codex before. He had read all of it, every page, because that was the kind of person he was. Decree 9 was an old law written 600 years ago and never used in the lifetime of any living human. It allowed the sovereign tier to reclassify a species as a subsentient labor class if that species was deemed a biological or social threat to galactic stability. They had used it on humanity, 12 billion people, every man, woman, and child on Earth, and across every human colony in space. All of them, with a single vote in a room Jay had never been allowed to enter, had been stripped of personhood under galactic law. He found Ara in her lab 2 corridors down. She was still awake, which did not surprise him. She was almost always awake. She was studying tissue samples from a species called the Lenny when he walked in and placed a data chip on her table without saying a word. She looked at it. Then she looked at him. She had known Jay long enough to understand that when he did not say a word, it meant something serious. She read the decrypted message. She read it 3 times. Then she started checking the authentication codes on her own, pulling up the Conclave's deep signal archive, cross-referencing timestamps, verifying sender signatures. Jay sat in the corner and watched her work. Neither of them spoke for a very long time. At the end of it, Ara set down her equipment and said, very quietly, "It's real." "Yes," Jay said. "They voted 3 days ago." "Yes." "And nobody told us." "No." They sat with that for a moment. Outside the lab's small viewport, the stars were completely still. Over the next 72 hours, they worked without sleeping. They pulled every piece of information they could access about the decree, about the vote, about the fleet movements that were quietly happening at the edges of the solar system. Because there were fleet movements. Conclave warships, more than either of them had ever seen gathered in one place, were positioning themselves in a slow, careful formation around Earth's star system. Not attacking. Not yet. Just surrounding. The way you surround something before you take it. Jay tried 3 times to send a message to Earth. Each time the signal was blocked by the station's outgoing filters, which had been quietly updated without any human staff being notified. He tried to contact the human ambassador. The ambassador's quarters were locked. He was told the ambassador was in a mandatory diplomatic rest period, which was not a thing that existed. On the 3rd day, Jay found a maintenance access port in the lower levels of the station, used for sending equipment diagnostic data to passing freight ships. It was old. It was slow. It was also not on the list of communications channels that had been filtered. He spent 4 hours encoding a compressed signal into the diagnostic stream and aimed it toward the last known coordinates of an Earth Defense Corps patrol ship. The signal reached Lieutenant Commander Kang while he was running a routine engine inspection on his vessel. His communications officer pulled him aside, handed him a handheld reader, and said nothing. Kang read the 3 lines of text that Jay had managed to compress into the signal before the channel cut out. He read them again. He set the reader down on a panel, very carefully, the way a man sets something down when he is afraid of what his hands might do if he is not careful about it. He stood still for a moment. Then he turned to his crew and told them to move to combat readiness, not as a drill. When they asked why, he told them the truth. Nobody on the crew said anything after that. They just moved. They started running checks and charging systems and preparing the ship for something that nobody had a name for yet because nobody had ever had to do this before. Back on Earth, the Conclave's official decree broadcast reached every government simultaneously. It was delivered in a flat, automated tone, the kind of voice that had no weight to it, like someone reading a grocery list. The message explained that humanity had been reclassified, that the transition period would begin in 30 days, that compliance was expected, and that any resistance would be met with appropriate force under Galactic Codex authority. The broadcast ended. For a few hours, the planet was very quiet. Then something happened that no one inside the Conclave had thought to plan for. There was no emergency meeting. No single leader gave a speech. No one issued a formal declaration. Instead, all across the planet and across every human colony in space, people looked at each other and understood something without needing it explained. Every military installation on Earth began moving at the same time. Soldiers reported to stations. Engineers ran to hangars. Scientists started pulling classified project files off restricted servers, not because anyone ordered them to, because they were human, and something had just told them they were not, and they were going to make the galaxy understand exactly how wrong that was. Jay, sitting in the dim light of a station maintenance corridor, did not know any of this yet. He only knew that somewhere out there, Kong had read his message. That was enough for now. The Conclave had done this before. That was the part most people in the galaxy did not know, but it was the part that mattered most. The Sovereigntier had passed Decree 9 7 times in the past 6 centuries. 7 times they had looked at a species that was growing too fast, thinking too differently, or simply becoming too inconvenient, and they had reclassified them with the quiet authority of a law that most species never read. Each time the species in question had protested, some had cried, some had begged. A few had even fought back in small and desperate ways that the Conclave's fleet crushed in a matter of weeks. None of them had responded the way humanity did. The first sign that something was different came 18 hours after the broadcast. The Conclave's fleet admirals, watching from their blockade positions around the solar system, reported that Earth's orbital traffic had increased by over 400%. Ships were launching from every major station, from every colony port, from repair docks that weren't even supposed to have functional vessels in them. The admirals sent a report to the Sovereigntier, noting that this was unusual. The Sovereigntier told them not to worry. Species in transition always panicked at first. The second sign came from a young signals officer named Nari. She was 26 years old and had been stationed aboard the IN's Ungyu, Earth's newest deep space vessel, for less than a year. Before the decree, her job was to monitor communication frequencies in uncharted space and log anything interesting. After the decree, her job became something else entirely. She sat at her station for 19 hours straight, with 3 cups of cold tea beside her and the Conclave's fleet communication encryption running on every screen she had access to. The Conclave's encryption was considered unbreakable by most species in the galaxy. This was because most species approached encryption the way the Conclave expected them to, by trying to find the key. Nari did not try to find the key. She watched the pattern of when messages were sent, how long they were, what frequency shifts happened between transmissions, and she built a map of meaning from the outside of the signal rather than the inside. It was not how any alien mathematician would have done it. It was exactly how a human who had grown up playing competitive puzzle games since she was 7 years old would do it. At hour 19, she cracked it. She sat and stared at the open text of the Conclave's internal fleet communications for a moment. Then she made a copy of everything, flagged the most critical intelligence for Commander Kang, and without asking anyone's permission, did the one thing that changed the shape of the entire conflict. She took the original decree, the full document, including the private session notes, the individual votes of every Sovereigntier member, and the internal justification documents that described humanity as, among other things, too emotionally volatile to be trusted with personhood rights. And she broadcast it, not through military channels, not on a protected frequency. She broadcast it wide and open and unencrypted across the main public communication bands that every species in the galaxy used for news and trade signals. She sent it to everyone. The galaxy woke up to the truth the way you wake up when someone throws cold water on your face. The Vorath, a species of careful and deliberate thinkers who had always considered themselves allies of the Conclave, read the justification documents, and found their own species mentioned in a 300-year-old private memo that recommended they had almost been reclassified too before they corrected their expansion behavior. The Lenni, small and peaceful traders who had done business with humans for 40 years, read the section of the decree that referred to human emotional bonds as primitive biological noise. They read it twice. Then they sent a formal objection to the Sovereigntier that the Sovereigntier did not answer. Kang read Nari's intelligence report while the Ungnyo was moving at full speed toward the blockade line. He was a man who had spent 20 years in military service and had learned to make decisions quickly and without much visible emotion. He read the report, looked at the fleet positioning data, and then called his chief engineer, Tay, to the bridge. Tay was the kind of engineer who made other engineers nervous because he built things that the equations said should not work, and then stood there calmly while they worked. The fold compression warheads that sat in the Ungnyo's lower weapons bay were his invention, a delivery system that bent space around a target area and released energy in a way that bypassed conventional shielding. The Conclave had reviewed the theoretical papers on fold compression weapons 3 years ago and declared the concept physically impossible. Tay had read their review. He had circled the mistake in the math and kept building. Kang did not ask Tay if the warheads were ready. He already knew they were. He asked Tay which of the Conclave's relay stations had the fewest escape routes. Tay pulled up a map and pointed to 3 locations without hesitating. The Ungnyo was fast. It was built for deep space, which meant it was built to go further and faster than anything the Conclave expected a ship of its size to manage. It crossed the edge of the blockade formation before the Conclave's sensor teams finished logging it as a contact. By the time 2 Conclave interceptors turned to pursue, the Ungnyo was already at the first relay station. The fold compression strike was precise. It did not destroy the station. It destroyed the transmission hardware. Yash the backup hardware and the emergency backup hardware. Then it moved to the second location, then the third. In 22 minutes, the Conclave's fleet coordination network went dark across 11 sectors. The admirals in the blockade fleet suddenly could not talk to each other. They could not talk to the Sovereigntier. They could not receive orders or send status reports or coordinate any kind of unified response. They were 31 ships sitting in formation around a star system. And they were suddenly doing it blind. Kang opened a channel to the lead Conclave vessel. The admiral on the other side demanded to know what humanity thought it was doing. Kang told him they were responding. The admiral said humanity had no right to respond, that under Decree 9, all military operations by a reclassified species were illegal under Galactic Codex law. Kang was quiet for a moment. Then he said very simply that humanity did not recognize Decree 9. That humanity did not recognize the authority of any body that had stripped 12 billion people of personhood without a single conversation, and that if the admiral wanted to discuss the codex further, humanity had already drafted revisions to 17 of its most critical sections and would be happy to share them at a formal session once the Conclave agreed to talk to humans as people. He cut the channel before the admiral could answer. On the Ungnyo, Nari was already monitoring the galaxy's public feeds. The story was spreading faster than anything she had ever seen. Other species were reading, other species were talking, and in the silence where the Conclave's coordinated response should have been, the only voice anyone in the galaxy could clearly hear was humanity's. The Conclave's military strategists had a model for how wars worked. It was a good model. They had built it over 500 years of observing conflicts between species across the galaxy, and it had proven reliable enough that the Sovereigntier trusted it the way you trust a bridge you have crossed 1,000 times. The model said that wars were won by the side with the most ships, the most firepower, and the most centralized command. It said that smaller forces could cause trouble but would eventually be overwhelmed. It said that emotion, improvisation, and chaos were weaknesses. The model was about to have a very bad few weeks. Ground Commander Day was not the most famous officer in Earth's Interstellar Defense Corps. He was not loud. He did not give speeches that made people feel electricity in their chests. He was a quiet man with a reputation for being extremely specific about his orders and extremely calm when things went wrong, which, in his experience, they always did. His soldiers trusted him for the same reason people trust a surgeon, not because he was exciting, but because he was precise. He was given the mission of retaking 3 human outposts that the Conclave had occupied in the first days following the decree. These were small stations, research posts, a supply depot, a relay hub, with skeleton crews of human workers who had been locked in their quarters and told they were now the legal property of the sovereign tier. The Conclave garrison forces at each location were small but armed. They expected that any human rescue attempt would be a rushed, emotional strike they could repel, or at least use as justification for requesting more ships. Day did not do a rushed, emotional strike. He spent 48 hours studying every structural scan of the 3 stations that Yoon had provided. Yoon was a scientist who had spent 9 years working inside Conclave facilities and had spent most of those 9 years making detailed notes about floor plans, access corridors, ventilation systems, emergency power routing, and guard rotation patterns, not because she was a spy, but because she was the kind of person who needed to understand the space around her to feel comfortable in it. Those notes were now the most valuable documents in the entire operation. Day's teams moved through each station like water moving through cracks. They came in through maintenance tunnels, through cargo bays, through access points that the Conclave garrison forces had not thought to guard because they did not appear on any standard security schematic. They moved quietly and they moved fast, and when they reached the Conclave soldiers, they did not open fire. They cut power to specific sections, sealed bulkheads by remote access, and isolated each guard unit from the others so that none of them could coordinate a response before it was already over. Every Conclave soldier was taken alive. Every human worker was found unharmed. Day's standing order throughout the operation was simple. No alien civilian or captured soldier was to be hurt. This was not a suggestion. This was the order. And his soldiers followed it without question because Day had explained the reason plainly. They were not fighting to become what had been done to them. They were fighting to prove that what had been done to them was wrong. You could not prove cruelty was wrong by being cruel. When the footage of the retaken stations reached Conclave news networks, something unexpected happened. The alien populations watching did not see the savage, an uncontrolled species the sovereign tier's justification documents had described. They saw humans carrying injured Conclave soldiers to medical bays. They saw a human engineer repairing a piece of alien equipment that had been damaged in the operation, carefully, without being asked. They saw Day standing in a corridor with a captured Conclave garrison captain speaking to him quietly, offering him water. The Conclave's own people started asking questions their governments could not answer easily. Meanwhile, Ara had become something she never planned to be. She had been freed from the station lockdown by Day's advance team, who had reached the orbital station as part of a broader operation to secure human diplomatic personnel. The moment she had a working transmitter and a clear signal, she started talking. Not to governments, not to military commanders. She talked directly to civilian populations across the galaxy, the ordinary people of the Vorith homeworld, the trading communities of the Lena, the farmers and teachers and craftspeople of a dozen species who had grown up knowing humans only as that young, strange species that was always in a hurry. She did not make arguments. She did not cite laws. She told stories. She described what it felt like to wake up one morning and learn that the government of the galaxy had decided you were not a person. She described Jay sitting in a corridor with a data chip in his hands, staring at something he did not want to be true. She described the human workers who had been locked in their quarters and told they were property, and who had spent those days quietly looking after each other and sharing the little food they had. She spoke simply, in language any species could follow, and she was honest about everything, including how frightened she had been. Nobody in the Conclave's diplomatic corps had thought to prepare for this. They had prepared for human aggression. They had not prepared for a human woman sitting in front of a transmitter, speaking gently, and making 400 billion people across 28 species feel something in the part of them that knew, regardless of what any law said, that what they were watching was wrong. At the military level, the human approach was creating chaos the Conclave had no doctrine for. The strategy that Kong's officers had developed, called simply Swarm, sent hundreds of small, fast vessels into the field, each one operating independently, each captain making their own decisions based on what was in front of them. There was no central command to target. There was no headquarters to destroy. Every ship was its own decision maker. And they all moved differently, because they were all different people making different choices, and the Conclave's fleet coordination systems were built to predict patterns, and there were no patterns. The Conclave tried 3 times to establish a unified counter-response. 3 times, the response fell apart before it could form, because the ships couldn't coordinate fast enough against targets that were never where the models said they should be. Jay watched all of this from a room where he had been placed after his release, a plain room with a single viewport and a table and a chair. He was not a soldier. He had never wanted to be. He watched his people fight, and he felt something that was not quite pride and not quite grief, but lived somewhere between them. He had spent 3 years on that station trying to make the galaxy see humanity clearly. He had been patient. He had been careful. He had believed, genuinely believed. That understanding was possible if you worked hard enough at it. He still believed that. He just understood now that you sometimes had to make people listen before they would hear you. He was already writing. The Sovereigntier had governed the galaxy for 412 years. In that time, it had managed wars, border disputes, species extinctions, economic collapses, and every kind of political crisis that 4 centuries of interstellar civilization could produce. It had survived all of them because it was, above everything else, unified. The member species of the Sovereigntier disagreed about many things, but they agreed on one thing that mattered more than all the others. The tier's authority was absolute, and anyone who challenged it was making a mistake they would not recover from. That agreement was now breaking apart piece by piece in front of everyone in the galaxy. The Vorth were the first major species to formally withdraw. Their council released a statement that was measured and careful and diplomatic in every sentence. They were always measured and careful and diplomatic. But the meaning underneath was plain. They had reviewed the historical records of Decree 9's previous applications. They had reviewed the private session notes that Nari had broadcast to the galaxy. They had found, in a document dated 311 years ago, Isara Sovereigntier internal memo recommending that the Vorath be reclassified unless they moderated their population growth and reduced their independent trade agreements. The Vorath had done exactly those things generations ago without ever knowing why the pressure to do so had suddenly appeared. They had spent 3 centuries believing it was their own choice. It had not been their own choice. Their statement was calm. Their withdrawal from the tier was immediate. The Lenni followed 2 days later. They did not issue a statement. They simply redirected their entire fleet, small ships, trade vessels, fast couriers, to a neutral zone and sent a single message to the Sovereigntier that said they would not be returning to the table until Decree 9 was annulled in full and every species reclassified under it was formally restored to legal personhood. That was the public collapse. The private one was worse. Yuna had spent the last several years as one of Earth's quietest political strategists, the kind of person who worked in the background of negotiations, wrote the talking points that other people delivered, and made sure that every agreement humanity signed was airtight. She was not flashy. She was methodical. When the decree came through and the Voreth reached out through back channels, asking if humanity had any framework for what a new galactic governing structure might look like, it was Yuna who got on a shuttle and flew to their delegation point. She and the Vorath Senior Council worked for 17 days straight. They pulled from human political philosophy, from Vorath governance traditions, from the founding documents of 4 different galactic coalitions that had failed over the past 2 centuries, studying each failure carefully to understand what had caused it. What they built was called the Ungyo Accords, named after the ship that had gone first into the fight. The Accords laid out the structure of a new governing body where no species got extra votes for being older, larger, or more militarily powerful. Every species got the same voice. Every law required genuine agreement, rather than the approval of a dominant tier. Every reclassification law in the existing codex was abolished permanently, with no mechanism for reinstatement. It was, Yuna told the Vorath Council quietly, the thing humanity had always wanted since the first day they joined the Conclave and realized the rules were written by the people who benefited most from them. The Vorath elder who read the final draft of the Accords sat with it for a long time. Then he said that his species had lived inside the Conclave's rules for so long they had forgotten to ask who the rules were for. He signed the Accords. While the politics moved, Ho was somewhere the politics could not reach. He was Kang's second in command, and possibly the person in Earth's military most comfortable with doing things that required not thinking too much about the risk. His mission had been planned for 2 weeks, revised 4 times, and ultimately approved with the understanding that if it went wrong, there would be very little anyone could do about it. He was taking a small team into the Sovereign Tier's home system, not to destroy anything, not to engage any fleet forces, but to reach the central administrative archive that held the Tier's complete historical records going back 4 centuries. The Tier's home system was defended, of course it was, but its defenses were built around the assumption that any attacking force would be a fleet, large, detectable, approaching from a direction that made sense militarily. Ho's team was not a fleet. It was 6 people in a modified courier vessel with its transponder codes cycling through stolen conclave freight identities every 40 minutes. They moved through the system the way freight moved through it, following the same boring routes, logging the same boring check-ins until they were close enough. They were inside the archive facility for 3 hours. They copied everything: 4 centuries of session records, private communications between Tier members, internal assessments of every species in the galaxy, the full history of every application of Decree 9, and something none of them had expected: a file documenting 4 species currently listed as protected members of the Conclave that had also been reclassified at various points, reduced to labor class status, and then quietly restored once they were deemed useful again, with their own histories edited and their populations never told. Ho transmitted the files to Nari's broadcast network from inside the archive facility and was in hyperspace before the Tier's security forces located the breach. When those files reached the public feeds, 4 species simultaneously discovered that their histories had been rewritten, that moments their grandparents had described as acts of voluntary cooperation with the Conclave had actually been periods of forced compliance under reclassification. The protests that followed inside those species' own systems made everything that had come before look quiet. 2 more Tier members withdrew. 3 others requested emergency suspension of their membership pending internal review, which was a political way of saying they could see which way things were going and did not want to be standing in the wrong place when it resolved. The Sovereign Tier now controlled less than a third of the members it had started with. In the chamber where Tier sessions were held, there were chairs for 41 species. On the day the remaining hardliner members gathered for what would be their final strategic meeting, 11 of those chairs were occupied. They looked at the empty chairs for a long time before the session started. Then the most senior member of the remaining Tier stood up and said that they had no choice but to take direct military action against Earth. That striking the human homeworld was the only move that would re-establish the Tier's authority clearly enough to bring wavering members back into line. Nobody in that room said it was a bad idea. That was the thing about people who had held power for a very long time. They stopped being able to imagine that power running out. The strike fleet was assembled from the Tier's remaining loyal forces. It was the largest single military operation the Conclave had mounted in over a century. The commanders who led it believed they were going to end the conflict. They believed that once Earth was forced to stand down, everything else would fall into place. They believed this because the model told them it would work, and the model had always worked before. Jay heard about the strike fleet from a Vorath intelligence officer who slipped a data chip under his door. He read it once. He already knew what Kang would do. He had known Kang for 15 years, and he understood that man the way you understand someone you have watched think through hard problems for a long time. He sat at his table and he opened the document he had been writing for 3 weeks, and he read through it one more time from the beginning, checking every clause, every sentence, every word. It was not a military document. It was a legal one, the charter for a new kind of galactic governing body. Precise and complete and built for a future where this never happened again. He made 2 small edits. Then he saved it and waited for whatever came next. The strike fleet dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of the solar system at 0347 hours, Earth Standard Time. There were 61 ships. It was the biggest force the remaining Sovereign Tier members had been able to assemble, pulled from 3 different fleets, crewed by soldiers who had been told they were going to restore order to a situation that had gotten out of control. The fleet commander, a senior officer of one of the Tier's oldest member species, had reviewed the engagement plan 14 times. His orders were to breach Earth's orbital defenses, disable the planet's communication infrastructure, and hold position until the human government formally accepted the decree and submitted to tier authority. It was supposed to be a show of force, something overwhelming enough that resistance would look pointless. What he found waiting for him was not what the plan had accounted for. Every ship humanity owned was there, not deployed in a defensive line, not scattered in a wide formation designed to cover angles or protect specific targets. They were assembled in a single mass. Warships, patrol vessels, retrofitted cargo ships, experimental craft that hadn't been officially commissioned yet, sitting in complete silence. Facing outward, with every weapon system active and every light on the hulls turned off so that against the darkness of space, they were barely visible until you were close enough that it was already too late to make comfortable decisions. Kang's voice came through on an open channel. He did not speak loudly. He never spoke loudly. He said that the fleet ahead of them had traveled a long way and that he respected the distance they had covered. He said that humanity had no interest in destroying them. He said that if the tier commanders turned their ships around right now, no one on either side would die today, and that, in his professional opinion, that was a better outcome for everyone, including the tier. He gave them 10 minutes to decide. The tier fleet commander sent back a response demanding unconditional human surrender and the immediate arrest of all military leadership. Kang received this message, read it, and set it aside. Then, when the 10 minutes were up, he gave the order to move. What followed lasted 11 hours and was the last military engagement of the conflict. The human fleet did not fight the way the tier expected. There was no neat battle line, no central formation to target, no command ship to disable to cut off coordination. It was the swarm doctrine on its largest scale, every captain operating independently, responding to what was in front of them, either moving and striking and falling back and moving again in patterns that the tier's tactical systems could not map fast enough to counter. Tay's fold compression weapons tore through shielding the tier had spent years believing was proof against anything. Nari fed real-time tier communications directly to every human ship commander so that every feint and repositioning the tier fleet attempted was visible before it was executed. The tier fleet commander tried to call for a ceasefire 4 times. Kang accepted on the 4th attempt, after it became clear that the tier's formation had broken apart completely, and that continuing would only mean more of their own people dying for a political decision that more than 2/3 of the conclave had already abandoned. There were no human ships destroyed. 19 tier vessels were disabled and boarded. The rest surrendered. When it was over, Kang sat in the command chair on his bridge for a long time without moving. He was not a man who celebrated. He was tired in a way that sleep would not immediately fix, and he felt the full weight of everything the past weeks had been. He thought about the people on those 61 ships who had followed orders they were given by a government that had decided humanity was not real. He thought about the human workers locked in their quarters in 3 small stations who had shared their food with each other and waited. He thought about Jay reading a message on a data chip in a dark communication room and sitting very still for a long time. He authorized the medical teams to begin working on the disabled tier vessels immediately. He was very specific about the order of priority, the most seriously injured first, regardless of which side they were on. The sovereign tier formally dissolved 12 days later. It was not dramatic. There was no single moment of collapse. The remaining 11 member species simply acknowledged one by one that the structure they had belonged to no longer functioned and that the authority it had claimed could not be maintained. Some of them did this with formal statements. Some of them simply stopped showing up to sessions until the session stopped being called. The chamber with 41 empty chairs sat unused for 3 weeks. Then a Vorath maintenance crew came and began quietly rearranging the furniture for the first meeting of the Free Galactic Assembly. The FGA's founding session was attended by representatives from 34 species. Jay sat at the human table and placed the document he had been writing for 3 weeks in the center of the table. It was the charter, clean, precise, built on the principle that no species got more say than another, regardless of how old or large or powerful they were. The assembly reviewed it for 6 days. They made amendments. They argued about language and precedent and implementation timelines. It was slow and occasionally frustrating, and exactly the kind of careful, deliberate work that building something meant to last requires. On the seventh day, they signed it. Jay was asked to serve as the first Secretary General of the Free Galactic Assembly. He declined without hesitation and nominated a Vorath elder who had spent 40 years in diplomatic service and whose quiet, steady judgment had been one of the reasons the Vorath had broken with the Tier when they did. The nomination was accepted unanimously. The gesture was noted by every species in the room and discussed in political commentary across the galaxy for years afterward. The humans, who had fought harder than anyone expected and won, and then handed the chair to someone else. Kang retired from active service a month after the final engagement. His last official act was ordering the Ungnyo's fold compression warheads to be disassembled and their core components repurposed. The resulting materials were transferred to a joint human-Lena engineering team led by Tai and Nari, who used them as power sources in a new generation of deep space construction vessels. Tai said the components were too good to sit in a weapons bay. Nari said she agreed, and that she was glad to be logging signals from uncharted space again, instead of cracking military ciphers at 3 in the morning. Era published all of her xenobiological research, 9 years of work, several significant discoveries, and more than a few findings the Conclave's own scientific community had dismissed as coming from a species that did not know what it was talking about, freely to every member of the FGA, with no patents and no restrictions. It was downloaded over 8 billion times in the first month. It changed the practice of interspecies medicine permanently. Day oversaw the construction of a memorial near the coordinates where the first Conclave blockade formation had positioned itself around the solar system. It was not built to celebrate a victory. It was built to hold a record. The full text of Decree 9, the vote counts, the private justifications, the names of every species and every official that had approved it. It was built in the belief that the only real protection against something happening again was making sure it could never be forgotten that it had happened at all. The former sovereign tier leadership was tried under the FGA charter, the exact document Jay's team had written during the weeks when Kang's fleet was fighting and Day's soldiers were moving through maintenance tunnels, and Ara was speaking to half the galaxy at once. The trials were fair, and they were slow, and they followed due process the way the decree never had. The sentences involved supervised programs of direct service to the species that the decree had been applied to. There was, in this, an irony that the galaxy noted clearly and that nobody pretended was accidental. A child named Ryu was 4 years old when the war ended. He had been born on a colony logistics ship 6 months into the conflict, which meant he had never known a galaxy in which humans were not free. His mother was a supply officer who had kept her ship running through the whole campaign, doing the quiet, unglamorous work of making sure the fighting ships had what they needed to keep going. One evening, on a station orbiting a neutral world that was now a hub for FGA diplomatic traffic, she stood with him at a large viewport and watched ships from a dozen different species moving through the space outside. Vorath cruisers, Lena traders, human patrol vessels, FGA transports with new markings that nobody had existed long enough to fully recognize yet. All of them moving together in the same space without threat. Ryu watched for a long time. Then he asked his mother why anyone had ever thought they could own people. She did not answer right away. She looked at the ships. She thought about the years before he was born, about the morning the broadcast came through, and what it felt like to hear that 12 billion people had been told they were not people. She thought about how quickly and completely humanity had answered that. Not with one great hero, not because someone gave the right speech, but because every single person who heard it already knew, without needing it explained, what the answer had to be. She put her hand on her son's shoulder. "Because they had never really met us," she said. Outside the viewport, the ships kept moving, easy and unhurried, through a galaxy that was not finished becoming what it was going to be, but was, for the first time in 400 years, genuinely trying.